This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Hello, my name is Heather Burke, and I'm a researcher here at the Institute of International and European Affairs. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Mr. Justice John MacMenamin, retired judge of the Supreme Court of Ireland, to discuss rule of law and the future of Europe. This podcast is part of the IIEA's Future Proofing Europe project, kindly sponsored by the Department of Foreign Affairs. Thank you, Judge, for joining me here today. You're certainly no stranger to this topic of the rule of law in Europe, having travelled to Poland in 2020 to represent the Irish judiciary and protest in support of your Polish judicial colleagues, as well as judicial independence more broadly. But now, over 4 years later, I'd like to turn to the current state of affairs in Europe in terms of support for the rule of law as we see it now in November 2024.
Thanks, Heather. Well, as you say, we're talking now in November 2024. And I think the first thing we have to do is look at the Europe we're dealing with in 2024. It's much changed even from 2020. And if you look at the challenges that Europe is facing at the moment, there are the internal challenges of populism, the difficulties of dealing with immigration, what's called nativism, identity politics, the remnants of the difficulties which arose in 2008 and to 2012, the democratic deficit, the need for massive investment, as recently announced by Mr. Draghi, the political difficulties which are existing in France and Germany, the risk of economic stagnation, and the ongoing problem of inequality. And they're just the internal issues which we're looking at. And also there's the internal political aspect because of the existence of illiberal democracy, illiberal democratic governments elected in Hungary, perhaps in Italy, perhaps in Slovakia, but also governments which are being supported by the right in Finland and Sweden. And even this week, we have the election of a new Romanian president who cannot be said to be a pro-European in his orientation. And all of that, during all of that time, there's a real problem of people who are disadvantaged, who feel that they have been the victims of inflation. And while some rich people have got richer, other poor people are feeling the effects of inflation. And that's just the internal problem. And then if we look at the external issues, there's climate, of course. There's Russia-Ukraine. There's the decline of the rules-based economic order and political order. There's multilateralism, the issue of tariffs, the election of President Trump in the United States, a new foreign policy of the United States vis-a-vis NATO. There's a realignment of the autocratic powers, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, all of which are rediscovering an identity of interest as opposed to the liberal democratic tradition. And then, of course, there's the challenge of enlargement, where the European Union has to look at how enlargement can be achieved in the context of Moldova, Serbia, Albania, and Montenegro. So they're just some of the external difficulties which are now facing the European Union, where there's a challenge to what used to be regarded as the old-fashioned liberal democratic order, and the European Union, which, to use the American phrase, used to be regarded by so many as the city on the hill. And all the while, during these geographically immediate issues, there are difficulties in the South, in Asia, Africa, where people are facing ongoing gross inequality, South America, and where the effects of climate are much more acute, where those countries correctly feel that they're the subject of discrimination. So all of those things make it very ironic when I look back to, say, 1999, when people said liberal democracy is so self-evidently succeeding that we can say that this is the end of history, and now it's just going to be a repeated pattern and everyone is going to be totally convinced about the validity of the liberal democratic tradition. Not so.
Not so indeed, Judge. And I think what's interesting from the very many symptoms, the very many issues that are affecting Europe, both internally and externally, is how rule of law pervades across all. I suppose it's a term we use often and we hear often, but from your perspective as a judge, but also as a citizen of a democratic country, what does respect for the rule of law mean, and how can we see it in our everyday lives?
I think that we have to start with the fact that the EU is, as people frequently point out, a sui juris entity. It's not a nation state. It doesn't have the cohesion or history of a nation state. And then you go to the question of what is EU identity, and then you're going to what is the rule of law. So if we talk about the rule of law, it embodies values like human dignity and freedom and democracy, respect for human rights, values like pluralism, non-discrimination, and also justice and solidarity and tolerance. And they're all values which you see in Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union. But the difficulty is those values don't necessarily have the same emotive value as when you're cheering for Ireland or cheering for your parish or for your county. We don't have, Europe doesn't have the same cultural history yet, and it's going to be a long way to go before it has that shared history, which I think is so important for creating cohesion. And while those values are expressed in the treaties, you need something more to use the time-honored phrase, to fill in the gaps. And that's where the courts come in and the rule of law comes in. And it's very important that we understand, I think, what the rule of law is, because each one of those issues that I was talking about earlier that I enumerated, each one of them will take a form which will emerge in the courts, either nationally or in the European Court of Justice. So what is the rule of law? I think it has these characteristics. It's, to use a negative definition, it's as opposed to the rule of man. In other words, it's not women, it's not dictatorship, not autocracy, but the rule by a set of principles which govern everyone. There was an old English phrase in the 18th century which says, "Be ye ever so high, the law is above you." And that, I think, expresses it very well, that the law is above everyone, even presidents, and in the 18th century, even kings. It's consistent, it's certain, it's non-retrospective, it consists in checks and balances, it exists in a democratic society, it involves democratic traditions, it involves an independent judiciary, and it involves institutions which try and maintain themselves as being politically neutral. And I think that's very important. We might come back to that later. It involves independent law enforcement by non-political police. And it means also a free, independent media, which are diverse and are pluralistic in their approach. So most of those values actually are embodied in our own constitution. But they're, I think, the essential parts of what the rule of law consists in. And I got interested in all this because I was in Russia in 1989 for a period of 2 weeks, just at the time when things were when the old Soviet Union was beginning to dissolve. And you could see first of all, there was a big lesson that regimes, however monolithic, and government structures, however apparently strong, could dissolve. And secondly, the effect that it had on ordinary people. When you actually saw a line of people where there were 46 people queuing, and I asked what were they queuing for? To buy one egg. When we saw, we were a group of lawyers, when we saw the effect of the procurator, who was the local prosecutor, who was more powerful than any judge in the locality. And that's what the rule of law is not about.
And I think it's that concrete example of you witnessing maybe the absence of the rule of law in a society that can really reinforce just how critical, how significant it is, while sometimes being invisible when it's working correctly. But I suppose the majority of people are not going to encounter courtrooms, they're not going to encounter the law on a daily basis, and those who might encounter it, you know, once or twice in their lives, it's usually one of the worst days of their lives. How can we, I suppose, bring values that are so apparent in the courtroom to become more of a living truth, perhaps in the classroom?
I think there are simple words: explain, explain, simplify, simplify, reach out, reach out, reach into schools, reach into communities. Make sure that when I'm speaking as a former judge, make sure that when we're engaging in the activity of being a judge, the way in which we do it is understandable to ordinary people. I think there's essential requirements. I also think that schools should look much more closely about education in democracy and the rule of law. I know that sounds a very abstract subject, but I think it would be really important, because I think there's a lack of understanding and appreciation. There was a song when I was young, which said, all in all, it seems to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And you don't know what the rule of law consists in until it begins to dissolve.
And moving now, as we look beyond Ireland and into the EU, as you mentioned earlier, we have a situation in Hungary where the rule of law is deteriorating at a rapid rate. The European Commission froze about 22 billion euros worth of funds under its rule of law conditionality mechanism, but then released 10 billion when Hungary threatened to veto EU supports to Kyiv in December 2023. To many, this caused the EU to lose credibility when it comes to protecting the rule of law. Do you see ways that the EU, the Commission, can regain this credibility?
I do. I think it's very hard to escape the Russian experience, what happened from 1991 onwards. The dissolution of the old Soviet Union led to obviously the dissolution of the political aspect of it, what was called the communist government. But what happened ultimately in Russia was unbridled capitalism for a period of years, without any checks and balances, without any anti-monopoly legislation, without any antitrust legislation, and without anything to protect people from falling out on the bottom of society. It was quite extraordinary the extent to which people, poor people, were left literally high and dry, and trying to sell even the smallest things in the street, because I was back in Russia later in 1997. And you see people trying to sell even little dolls in the street. It was really very, very depressing. And if we look at Hungary, I think when the Cold War ended and when the Soviet Union fell, there was this hubristic feeling that everything was going to be wonderful and there was going to be vast prosperity. And I think that people tended to equate two things: prosperity and the and the rule of law as embodied in the European Union. And if we look what happened in Hungary in the early 2000s, they had a very fluctuating political situation. Fidesz, which was Viktor Orban's party, got into power ultimately when there was a wave of disillusionment in 2010, and he achieved a supermajority. And what did that mean? Well, that meant he could change the constitution. it meant that he could actually engage in a manipulation of the constituencies. It meant that so far as the judiciary were concerned, he could control appointment, promotion, assignments, create officers of state who would actually supervise and control the judiciary. And that fed into attempts which were real to suppress the media, and also into education, and of course, the identification of victim groups who were immigrants. All of them rather grim echoes of the 1930s. Similar things happened in Poland to an extent where I think sometimes people don't recognize the extent to which, despite the fact that each one of those populist movements seeks to rely on extreme nationalism, they're actually quite international in their application, in the sense that Poland tended to follow quite closely what was happening in Hungary. When the Law and Justice Party was elected in 2015, it again sought to control the judiciary, it sought to control or suppress the media. When I was on a European a Council of Europe body called CCJE, I met a Polish judge in 2007, and she described the extent of harassment there was of so many judges when they were dealing with individual cases. So the government, the Kaczynski government in 2015, effectively sought to introduce the same types of illiberal democracy as had been introduced in Hungary. And what are those characteristics? Well, identifying outsiders, culture wars, identifying immigrants, engaging in economic nationalism, and that in turn leads to a policy where they seek to enhance executive power, and also where they seek to control judiciary, elected representatives, the media, and the various organs of society which might pose a challenge.
And when it comes to the EU's response to, first of all, Poland, and now I think more so Hungary, do you see ways for improvement? Do you see it as a necessary evil that funds are conditioned on protecting the rule of law? Do you see ways forward for the EU in promoting Hungary's rule of law protection?
Yes, I do, but I think I don't think we can use the rule of law as being a magic wand. I think ultimately you have to bear in mind that these illiberal democracies were actually elected by the people. So the resolution of these issues is less through courts than through the people. I think that so far as the courts are concerned, there are, of course, issues which bear directly on the way in which courts interact within the European Union, such as the concept of trust and mutuality, and of course, the much more severe mechanism which you mentioned, Heather, of Article 7 and the withdrawal or the withholding of funds. You have to be careful, though, that by engaging in such stark measures, that you don't actually enhance the standing of the leader, who then says, we're all victims now and we're being done down by the European Union. So it's something where I think you have to be subtle. I think the resolution is political. And I would also have a concern, which I think is worth expressing, which is that there is a close link, of course, between Prime Minister Orban and President Trump. And I would be concerned that there might be a temptation to use Prime Minister Orban as a route to the ear of President Trump on behalf of all of Europe when issues of competition and tariff arise. And I think we should be very careful about that, because Europe must maintain its values and must maintain its identity. And I think it's important that we should be true to ourselves in the European Union. I think that one tends to see these things in abstract, but when you actually see there is an MEP, an Italian MEP called Salis, Ilaria Salis, and if you Google her and look at the way she was involved in a demonstration in Budapest against extreme right-wingers who were commemorating Nazi sympathizers in 1945. If you just see the way she was treated when she was in custody, inhuman and degrading conditions, when she was brought into court with her hands manacled, with her feet shackled, wearing a restraining band around her waist. Unfortunately, it was decided that she was going to run for the European Union, and she's now a member of the European Parliament. I don't hold any brief for her politics at all. I don't know what her politics are, but it just shows you that what's called a liberal democracy can have real impact on people.
You spoke about the EU's values being integral to EU identity, and I think that is something so true. It's in Article 2, TEU. And another way in which the EU looks to ensure respect for those values is through its rule of law report, which is published on a yearly basis. I suppose it's somewhat of a peer review of member states' domestic situations in respect of the rule of law. But now in recent years, they've extended this rule of law report to look at candidate countries and their rule of law situations. You also mentioned enlargement at the very beginning. And so I'd like to ask, how important is ensuring respect for the rule of law before countries join the EU?
I think it's vital. While I'm delighted that the EU is engaging in the rule of law reports every year, I would say it took a long time to happen. What was happening in Hungary was going on since 2010. What was happening in Poland was going on since 2015. The EU only seemed to really address the issue in 2020. That took a long, long time, and by that stage, the damage is done. And as people keep repeating, it is much, much harder to reverse an undermining of the rule of law than it is to actually protect the institutions. It's very hard to undo what's been done, the damage that's been done. You have to protect.
And I think, as you said as well, we are seeing the rise of authoritarian governments within the EU. It's not only outside when we look internally, whether it be Hungary, whether it be Italy. I'm interested in your thoughts about how we can future-proof Europe at a time when we are witnessing this trend. Do you think there are ways that we, as the EU, as member states of the EU, can preemptively protect or safeguard the rule of law in such countries?
I do, but I think I mean, the last report on this precise issue said that it's necessary to make sure that the changes that are introduced, the reforms that are introduced, are irreversible. I think that's a very important phrase. It's a very important word. It's easier said than done. I think you have to ensure, you must ensure that the process of enlargement does not imperil the fundamental values of cohesion and identity. Of course, there are circumstances, political considerations. Of course, we look at events with inverted commas around the word. Of course, we look at timing. Of course, there's an instinct to say, get everyone engaged within the European Union as soon as we possibly can. But we can't lose sight of what the European Union is supposed to be about, and we can't lose sight of the need for cohesion and identity and the maintenance of the values which are so fundamental. It's harder than it looks, and our experience thus far, even in countries that are already part of the European Union has demonstrated that it's harder than it looks to give democracy and the rule of law roots, to grow roots, because preferably it comes from the bottom up and not from the top down.
And finally, I'd like to ask you about Michael McGrath, who will be the new commissioner with responsibility for democracy, justice, and rule of law. Included in this role, in his mission letter from Ursula von der Leyen, was the finalization of the EU's accession to the European Charter on Fundamental Rights. So we have these two legal systems in Europe, between the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights. Do you see the bridging of these two legal systems as a means to improve the rule of law, or are you worried it might result in a more convoluted EU legal system?
I do, but I think we have to look at the issues that may arise in seeking to deal with these two systems. And if we just think about it for a second, the way in which, for example, the value of autonomy of EU law, that's a very, very big issue. The fact that you will have a court in Strasbourg perhaps dealing with issues that will not involve all of the judges. There are 46 judges in the court in Strasbourg. That goes much, much further than the European Union. Then, as well as that, there are all sorts of really quite complex issues. As well as autonomy, there's the issue of mutual trust. Can, for example, human rights be properly protected in European arrest warrants or execution of judgments? There are issues in the area of freedom and security. There's the question of whether processes such as rendition under the European arrest warrant should be not mechanistic and make sure that human rights values are protected. There's migration. There's identification of who should be defendants in any case. Should it be the European Union or a member state? And then I think there's another issue which people may not so readily appreciate, which is people talk about law as being the cement or the glue of the European Union, filling in the gaps. But I'd make 2 points. First of all, you have to be very, very careful about not making the law a surrogate for politics. If it becomes too purposive, if it becomes too identified with achieving particular ends, such as integration, then I think a question of legitimacy can arise. But as well as that, I think there's a second issue, which is about the interpretation of law. This is a very judgy point, but the court in Strasbourg has developed a very sophisticated jurisprudence in relation to the extent to which the glue, the cement, the principle can be made apply in a particular situation. So it allows for a margin of appreciation. How will that margin of appreciation concept be reconciled with the autonomy of European law itself, and also the fact that in the jurisprudence of the Court of Justice, you have definitions which are a single autonomous meaning. And I think that's particularly interesting in the context of the constitutionalization of the European Union. It goes to the question of how that court is composed, the work that the Court of Justice is going to take on, the personnel who will be in that court. Will they have a strong human rights background? Because if you're engaging in constitutional values, perhaps you don't necessarily want somebody who comes from a bureaucratic background or a political background. And I think there's a fundamental distinction between a constitutional court on the one hand and a Conseil d'Etat on the other. So I think they're all issues which the Commissioner McGrath will have to face, and they're not easy.
Thank you, Judge MacMenamin. On one final note, I'd like to ask, after your decades of experience in law, when you look to the future of Europe, are you hopeful?
Yes, I am. I'll tell you why I'm hopeful. I think that despite the fact that there are all those difficulties and issues which Europe is facing, I think that the values and ideals underlying it are so self-evidently they so self-evidently express the human spirit and come closer to the human spirit that we can actually say that democracy and the rule of law isn't perfect, but it comes better than it achieves better things than any other system. But what's necessary? I think that every one of us who are involved in law, every one of us who are involved in the many institutions of democracy, have to remember it's all about people and to connect, only connect, to use the phrase of one of the great English authors. We've got to ensure that we maintain our links with ordinary people. There's one more thing. I think we have to be very careful to ensure that the distinction, a fundamental distinction, is drawn between the institutions of democracy and the rule of law and the policies that some particular party or government apply when they're in government. We have to protect the neutrality of the institutions. Those institutions allow for changes of government, but we cannot allow the policy of populism, which seeks to actually confuse the institutions of the rule of law and democracy with the policies which a particular party sought to apply.
On that note, Judge MacMenamin, I'd like to thank you so much for your time, for what has been an interesting, engaging, and hopeful discussion. And I look forward to talking with you again in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Heather.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.